You good? All right. Well, welcome back for lunch. So I'm Von Welch, and I work down at Indiana University, where I run a Center in Applied Cybersecurity Research. And that is honestly a really fun role because you get to do a mix of some applied research as well as helping a lot of scientific, open source, and nonprofit groups with their cybersecurity. And in this role, I actually have responsibility for a number of different organizations' cybersecurity, and I've had some back in my past. You can find me on Google. This stuff's all open. And so over the years, I've been in a CISO or quasi-CISO role for a number of medium organizations. And so this is where I'm coming from in this talk. And the second perspective, which at least has always been my experience, is when you're in a CISO, you are far from a dictator. So everything gets to be negotiated, everything has to be worked through with people and soft skills. So just a couple bases. So a couple reasons why I wanted to give this talk. So first, I'm just noticing looking around and seeing it in my own roles, cybersecurity is just getting harder. I think everyone knows it here, but attention that's being put on it, feeling more and more like you're in the spotlight if you're in charge of cybersecurity. The other thing I tend to notice working with information security staff is they tend to put way more emphasis on the technology side of things. Not that the technology side of things aren't important, but it's not all there is to it. And so one of the things I'll talk about in this talk is balancing that out. Third point is trying to nudge art a little bit more towards a science. Translation, try to take some of the stumbling, fumbling guesswork I've done earlier in my career and trying to organize it into a process. And so my hope is that the least experienced, somebody who's newly in a role where they're in charge of cybersecurity would find this most interesting and useful. For some of you who've been around the block a couple times, maybe we'll find some good things to debate about and would love any feedback on this. This is me trying to distill these kind of organic processes in my brain into something a little bit more organized. So I am not going to talk about the entirety of being a CISO today. Just mention a couple things I'm not going to talk about and give you some references in the slide. There's a whole bunch of sort of program and organization development you have to do, getting different groups in line. And I actually really love, there's a nice document out of the Software Engineering Institute. These are the folks who do the CERT over at Carnegie Mellon on this. I'll refer you to that. The other is you do an awful lot of management, leadership, development of your workforce. We all talk about having a hard time finding InfoSec folks. I spend an awful lot of my time growing InfoSec folks and developing along. So, and actually, this is what higher ed does quite a bit. And there's a group called Educause. They have a nice template out there on sort of cybersecurity leadership. So what I want to talk about today is focus on one specific role that a CISO has. It's a challenge guaranteed to come up, it seems like almost every single day. And it looks something like this. You're going to get an email. It's going to be from someone in your organization. It's going to be some change they want to make to the infrastructure. My quip joke would always be, securing infrastructure would be so easy if it weren't for all the users and the developers and management all around it, right? Like that old joke. So some change is coming down. It's not obviously the worst thing in the world, but it's asking you to change something about your security stance, to do some change to the infrastructure. And they're like, is this okay? And you're going to get a stream of these things. So just more examples, and almost all of these are semi-anonymized questions and emails that I've gotten in my day-to-day life. Some of them are vulnerability response, right? the website's vulnerable, but it's going to take a reboot and it's going to be down for 10 minutes and man, we're going to hate having to interrupt all our users. Why we do that? Can it wait till tonight? You know, you're answering questions like that, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and it's enough to slowly give you an ulcer over time, trying to figure out and worry about how to answer all these individual questions. So how do you go about this stream of small questions? It's sort of death by 1,000 cuts. So the first thing I want to mention is be extremely thankful you're being asked. If you're actually getting asked these questions, you're doing something very, very, very right. Consider the alternatives, and I've run into these situations too. DevOps just deployed the new version and your firewall is breaking it. It's always phrased that way too, by the way. And oops, now you've got a live fire on your hand burning down your actual front-end website. Or even worse, the new server's been compromised. What new server? I've been here too. You know, you're finding out, you're doing asset inventory as part of incident response. This is no fun. This is why it's good to be asked before these things happen. So this is an image that's been around for a while, and it's usually a joke about, you know, cybersecurity implementations. But slightly different take on it. You want to avoid as CISO being that gate in the middle of the image. You don't want people going around you, and guess what? They'll always find ways to go around you. Either it's the old cable in the floor, or they'll just organizationally set it up. Or what I love is, you know, they'll go contract it now from some cloud service, something or other provider, right? They'll find some way of getting around you. And so you have to figure out some way of not being that gate, of actually getting people to talk to you. So let me sort of step back now. So what is the role of the CISO? And, you know, Wikipedia is pretty good at these things. We could debate this exact definition up here, and it's a pretty good, you know, sort of corporate sounding, you know, executive responsible for establishing and maintaining enterprise vision, strategy, and program to ensure information, assets, and technology are adequately protected. And I always love that, right? So this is really the question we're getting to. What the heck does adequately protected mean? All right, this is really what we're boiling down to. Are you still doing your job if you allow those two holes in the firewall? So the first thing I want to point out is, and this is a very natural inclination for those of us who watch all the things that can go wrong, we can't get zero risk. Who here has heard the old joke, you know, it's really easy to secure a computer? Yeah, you lock it in a safe, put it at the bottom of the ocean, perfectly secure. You've just pushed your risks to absolute zero. And I was sort of Googling around for a good pithy quote about, you know, risk, and if you push your risk to zero, you're not going to get anything done. I mean, this is sort of the key is, no organization, nothing out there works without taking on some risk. I know down at Indiana University, we actually have staff that do nothing but manage risk. I mean, not even InfoSec risk. Risk, period, for the university. And actually, interesting tidbit, InfoSec risk does not make our top 10. So just an interesting data point. So anyways, I thought this was a nice quote about risk and not taking risk on and basically getting nothing done otherwise. So this is not your goal. Your goal is not to drive risk to zero. This, in a nutshell, is what I think you're trying to achieve. This has sort of been my vision, is you're trying to achieve this balance. The mission of your organization against the risk you're taking on. So this is the mental heuristic. I know, it's a nice little cartoon. It doesn't really tell you anything, but it gives you a model to shoot for. So let me come back to the question now. So given a little bit of context here on what that goal is, approach this question and dissect. So we've determined no leads to the box at the ocean and leads to people just sort of driving around you. So that's obviously not the right answer. So I'll come back to another quote here. What you really need here is good judgment. And you get good judgment from experience, which you get from bad judgment, right? So this is the, probably 10 years of my career here in a nutshell, is making mistakes and answering those questions over and over again, trying the no, no, no route, then saying yes at the wrong times, or not considering the right factors. And so what I'm trying to do with this talk is I'm going to try to distill some, I'm not claiming it's good judgment yet, but let's call it better than bad judgment. And just get out here a little bit of some heuristics into how to go about this. So, in thinking about how I answered this, I found myself organizing my thinking into what I'm going to call sort of 5 perspectives. And they're the 5 that I have up here on the screen. Some of these, you'll probably recognize most of these terms. And I want to talk a little bit about each one of these perspectives. And the idea is I'm trying to think of this as my framework now. Whenever one of those questions hits, I walk through these 5 things to help me get the balance. And a key thing, if you go back to the model here, it seems a little bit lopsided, but I'm realizing 4 of these things really sort of create or help me instantiate the risk. And then the 5th is really what weighs against it and drives the benefit side of the risk mission heuristic. So let me start with that one, because this is actually my advice, is before you start worrying about the risk that this question creates, because that's our natural inclination as InfoSec people, is, probably most of you, as you read that question up here, you're already looking at, you're connecting to a main database, you're opening firewall ports, the risks are just sort of adding up in your mind just naturally. So my advice is always stop and need to figure out here what's driving this question. How does it relate to your organization's mission? And 2 key reasons for doing this. One is a longer-term cultural thing, and this is just something you need to understand. What is your organization's actual risk tolerance around this? And so just a couple examples of this that I've seen is, think about if you're in a startup. The startup's big risk is being beat to market or running out of venture capital. Really, if you go in and try to introduce a NIST-style risk management framework in a startup, you're done. That conversation's not even going to happen. The other is, take something like Indiana University, Fortune 100 or something, huge reputational investment. Trust is a big deal. They have PR departments to develop trust, much less InfoSec departments. Incredibly low risk tolerance. So you have to understand where your organization is on this scale. And it will evolve over time. So you have to keep your finger on that pulse. So this is just sort of a background you need to understand from your organization's leadership and management. Then you come back to the change specifically. How does this change fit into your business process? This is where, I don't know if any of you were in here for Wolfgang and Stephanie or Josh's talks this morning, but this nails that on the head, right? Listen at this point. Ask them, why are you doing this? What are you hoping to accomplish? And this is going to tell you a couple things. What's the benefit? What is it you're hoping to get? Is this a new product line that's going to bring in millions, or translate that to a higher ed if you're going to bring in thousands of new students, or some huge new revenue stream? Then whoa, you've got a lot of benefit here that can be brought in to counterbalance this risk. On the other hand, hopefully you don't find this very often, but you may just find it's some other team that's kind of screwing around and they want a new, ticket server to replace their old one because they don't like the GUI. Well, okay, guess what? You're now in a very different conversation. The other thing you're going to find as you listen is you really will start understanding all the subtle nuances. The technical change that's in the question, the firewall holes, the new server, the data, that doesn't really tell you the business level. What's going on here? And you may find out other things. This may be tied to some huge strategic push that the accounting department has to get the finances fixed, right? I mean, there are these ties to the business level that you really need to understand about the question and really boil this up to what is that benefit. So this is this is why start with this. Figure out what's on the benefit side of that set of scales in terms. And then think about the risks to see if they appropriately balance it out. So shifting over to the risk side now, and the first of the 4 areas, situational awareness. I suspect a number of you or InfoSec can teach me some about how to do good situational awareness. But the thing that I tend to emphasize in this is, there's what's going on today, but try to look, you don't want to get all strategic in 5 to 10 years down the road. I don't think anyone in IT is that good. But what's this going to mean in 6 months? So for example, right now, just as a lens, I'm thinking of a lot of things through the lens of ransomware. Right? What are the changes that ransomware is going to bring in? Suddenly data that 3 years ago was worthless because no one could monetize it, guess what? They figured out how to monetize it. It's worth something to you, otherwise you probably wouldn't have it. So now a lot of new data sets I'm asking, key thing is gosh, what would happen to us if this data gets withheld from us? How valuable is this data? So, look a little bit down the road and think about this. What trends and attacks are you seeing that you interpolate out 6 months, a year, 2 years from now would really attack this? So this is just think about a little bit future and what's going on here. Compliance and legal, this often tends to be fairly straightforward. The nice thing about this particular perspective, the second of the 4, it tends to be relatively cut and dry, though I have seen HIPAA experts debate about HIPAA compliance and what it actually means in business associates, et cetera, et cetera. You can get into it. But for the most part, this tends to be good. And the main thing here is develop friends with your legal counsel or your GC's office on this, because you're going to need them. You're going to want to understand, and this will be a great thing as you understand the business process. Otherwise, a terabyte of data looks like a terabyte of data, but figuring out if it's a terabyte of PHI or a terabyte of, sales records or whatever, right? This is where you need to understand what's going on so you can figure out, and a key one in here that don't often think about in terms of legal things is we live in a case right now where every state has their own data breach notification requirements. And depending upon your organization, you may be under different states, or you may just decide to do what California does because it tends to be the strictest, right? But understanding this particular thing is another good place. So understanding the risk that it brings about because of the particular data that's involved is one of those 4 lenses. Understanding where that data is going to live, very key. So implementation. And what I mean by this, so this is honestly one of the places in the CISO job where you still get to be that sort of technical leader. And my advice is always have a good security architecture. Understand, and some basic rules that, and I'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slide. But the key thing is with the security architecture, and this is where it can hang some people up is, you get a vision in your mind of what the security is going to look like for your organization. Don't get too married to it. It's never going to be pristine and perfect, but it gives you an end state in mind. You're going to have lots of exceptions, and actually handling all those exceptions are the fun part. But sort of what do I mean by it? Think about in your organization, who and what do you trust, and to do what? Right? To what extent are your developers trusted in terms of accessing your operational? To what extent do you trust, third parties that may be working in the relationship? Have that trust model down. Understand what your system administrators are trusted to do, not do. If you're really big, you start getting into separation of duty and whatnot on that front. Where should your data be and not be? This always gets fun and gets into incident response and whatnot. Knowing what parts of your data, if you do a good network segmentation, which I'm a big fan of, understanding what parts of your network are for what purposes, and then mapping down, okay, now where should data live on those different parts of your networks. This starts giving you a good start to an architecture. Then you get more and more advanced. Well, these networks should be able to talk to these networks and vice versa, right? Course level, high level thinking, so that when somebody comes back and says, well, this server wants to talk to the database, and you're like, those are existing in parts of my organization. I don't want talking to each other, right? To keep things simple. A big part of the security architecture is trying to simplify things down so they fit into your head. This is one of the big challenges with modern IT, is it gets so complicated, it doesn't fit in our head anymore. And if you can't find ways to sort of heuristically get it simple enough down that you can hold it in your head, my experience is once something doesn't fit in your head anymore, you just start thrashing. And it becomes much harder to manage, cognitate, think about, manage. Then, like I said, don't get married to your architecture. It's going to have exceptions. But track them. Remember why you made them, so that if you revisit them, you can go, do you still need this? So that eventually you're going to end up with some Swiss cheese-like looking holes, but keeping that to a minimum, remembering why those holes are there, are really important. And then, of course, you can think about compensating controls for all this. If you think about making an exception, you can think about ways to manage it and getting into ways of changing that back. So, maybe that server over there now has to live up to some higher standard than the rest of servers in that part of the organization. So some questions to ask here. Obviously directly added risk is one that we readily tend to think about. The second one here is back to my point. The complication. Any change in the infrastructure that starts making things more complicated is adding risk indirectly. And so this is the key thing that I've learned to think about, is just, even if this all seems secure, is it just making things more complicated, which is going to make things more confusing, so then nobody can remember exactly what's going on. And if there's an incident, then there's some more traffic that we have to ignore. And so thinking about complication as an added risk there. The mitigations. And then the longer term point, as you're keeping track of all your exceptions to your architecture, look at them every once in a while. Are they starting to tell a story? Is your architecture really just not living up to what the organization is doing? And so that may be a sign that you need to revisit your mental model of what the organization's doing. If you're just getting so many things in that just don't fit your model, that's a red flag that you need to step back and think about what's actually going on and make sure you understand it. Fourth bullet, people and culture. I love this Drucker quote. Culture's going to eat strategy for breakfast. You can set policies, you can get strategies from the CEO on down, and until you change culture, they're not going to have much of an impact. And so you've got to understand the culture of what's going on. And so a key thing to think about, so it is my claim in any organization, the vast majority of security decisions are not made by the security group. They're made by everybody else in their day-to-day activities, opening emails, developing code, architecting services, agreeing to new business plans, right? It just boils down to the security group to try to manage those risks. So as this comes in, you think not only about the technical change, but who's going to be managing those technical changes? Who's going to be responsible for them? In my experience, we all have different groups in our organizations that we trust more or less to do these different things. And, thinking about who's being involved can help you, balance what the risks actually are here. Obviously, this is fragile as people can come and go, but, I think as a CISO, usually the list of risks that you're managing is already longer than your arm. So if you can find some that, because of the people involved, you can take this off your top 10 list, that's a great thing. Another way to put it is, you can love all your children equally. That doesn't mean you treat them all equally. The other thing in terms of culture in people is what I referred, and I heard a colleague refer to this beautifully, as relationship risk. And so this goes back to the extreme was the example I gave earlier, the culture of no, right? If you always say no, it's not even a risk anymore, right? You've destroyed that relationship. But there's a more subtle question here, understanding the importance of whatever's going on here to whoever's asking you, wanting to keep that relationship alive. So I'm convinced, and I don't know how to quantify this, but there does get to be a point where if things start getting subtle, the technical risk may still be there, but you know that saying no means that this group is never going to come back to you again or is going to avoid you next time. You may actually decide that being in the loop and accepting a little bit more technical risk is worth it than if you were to say no a little bit more and risk being cut out of the loop. And I think this is a really delicate balancing point, but it's tipped a couple close technical calls for me in terms of making decisions. I don't think you can always maintain, you've got to balance your level of acceptable risk with the drives of the other groups that you're going through. And so this is a tough one, but I think it's a very real risk that's out there. And I want to give a bonus suggestion. Be creative. Nobody says that the risks that are in the question are the only risks on the table. This can be an absolutely great time to go, okay, we can do this, but can we get rid of this service over here now? Or can we do a trade? If you can drive your total risk down by accepting this new risk and getting rid of an old one. So think creatively in terms of, use a buzz term, your entire risk portfolio when something like this comes in. You may be able to let this one come in and get something back in return that lets you sleep a little bit easier at night. So in conclusion, I just wanted to put this framework forward here and give you these 5 lenses to think about. So when a question comes in, and you're in that CISO role and somebody wants to make a change to your infrastructure, they're asking for something to you that, initially just seems to bring new risk to your organization, to your plate, to think through this. Start with the organizational mission, risk tolerance, understand the benefits, listen to them. I think we almost have a theme going here in this room this morning, and understand what they're trying to do, and start with that. So load up on why is this a good thing to do. And then once you understand that and you understand all the subtleties, you can circle back through all the other reasons that will bring the risk to it with an eye towards each one as you think about it as how it could be mitigated given the organizational mission, that business context of this decision. So with that, I'm going to thank you for your attention on this one. I welcome any feedback on this. I'd love to sort of keep evolving this into a guide not only for myself, but hopefully others might find it useful as well. Thank you.